welcome to our fourth and final session of American Religious Traditions. Last week we described how immigrants from Asia came to the west coast of this country, and by the 1880s, at least 3 million Chinese immigrants had come to our western shores. And they brought with them the deep religious traditions from China. There is Confucianism, which their foundational scriptures are the Analects, and Taoism, where the Tao Te Ching. I've read both of these, and these are the scriptures for these Eastern traditions. There also were Buddhists who came. Buddhism had begun in India, in the Deer Park, where Buddha preached his first sermon. It was in Varanasi. But Buddhism as a missionary religion really moved from India into Tibet, China, Japan, Korea, and elsewhere. And this tradition became Zen Buddhism. And many texts are from that tradition: the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, the Vedas. All of these traditions had their scriptures as well. And these came to our shores, some of them to Hawaii and some to the western part of the United States. From Japan came Shintoism. And so all of these traditions were very, very important as they came to our part of the world. The United States, of course, had been predominantly Protestant, Catholic, Jew, and these other world religions were starting to come with different immigrant groups. And one of the great values of the Eastern traditions are the emphasis that they have placed on prayer, meditation, contemplation, if you will. And this appealed to our society, not only when they first came in the 19th century, but in the 20th century. Many of us can remember when the Beatles, a very popular group, became interested in Hinduism and Eastern religious traditions. And transcendental meditation was very important in those years as well, and has continued to be. Now, Christian theologians like Thomas Keating emphasize that the contemplative tradition also came in Christianity. We have the great mystics going back to the Carmelites and others who have brought that mystical and meditation to Christianity. And indeed, the other great world religions, Judaism has the Kabbalah, and Islam has Sufism. So mysticism or contemplative religion came to us from a variety of religious traditions. One of the last groups to become prominent, but is still very prominent in our country, is Islam. Muhammad had given us the Quran, and through immigration and intermarriage by the 1980s, between 2 and 3 million people were Muslim, were practitioners of Islam. I remember reading when they had more Muslims in our tradition than Presbyterians, and that became very important. The Islamic Center was established in Washington, D.C. in 1952, and we know of the Noor Islamic Center here in Columbus. And so that tradition has become much more prominent in our American pluralistic culture. Of course, when I was growing up, the Nation of Islam, or what was called Black Muslims, founded by Elijah Muhammad, was very important. It was not viewed as being wholly orthodox. Malcolm X actually went to Mecca for the Hajj and came back with a much different view, which brought him in conflict with the Nation of Islam. But this group was also very important during the Civil Rights era. It represented more of a separatist impulse politically than those leaders like Martin Luther King and others who were bringing their Christian tradition to bear on the civil rights of the day. Now, in this country, we also had many traditions that were homegrown, if you will, or began here, but then also took place in other parts of the world, was taken around the world. When I was living and worshiping in Washington, D.C., I remember seeing the temple. As you went around the outer belt, you could see on the horizon the large temple for the Church of Jesus Christ and Latter-day Saints. This tradition began in New York with Joseph Smith, and then after his death, there was a lot of conflict as they moved west. Brigham Young eventually took them to Utah, and the migration of what we call the Mormons to Utah became very important, and it became a fast-growing religion worldwide. I know it became very important in Hawaii and other parts of the world. Of course, Salt Lake City in Utah is the center of the Mormon tradition. But there are many, many other groups, Seventh-day Adventists, the Jehovah's Witnesses. Some of the Pentecostal traditions began here in this country and were taken to other parts of the world. Judaism itself was changed when Reform Judaism was developed by Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise. And so Reform Judaism became significant. They established Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati in 1875. And this tradition was, as it sounds, a reform of Judaism. There were many Jews who wanted to retain the faith as they knew it when they came from Eastern Europe or Russia or other parts, Sephardic Jews, others. And so there are Orthodox and conservative traditions in Judaism. But Reform Judaism was significant in this country. I myself remember 2 weddings I've done at First Community, and I had as a co-officiant Rabbi Donna Adler, which is an example of how in Reform Judaism women are ordained. Not necessarily true in other parts of the tradition, much as what has happened in Christianity, where some traditions ordain women and others do not. But Judaism had a variety of expressions in this country. Now, what was underlying so many things at this time were changes in society and culture and challenges to traditional faith perspectives and to the authority of Scripture or other bases of authority in religion. We know of the rise of fundamentalism, if you will. In the Scopes trial in Dayton, Tennessee, which was made famous in the play Inherit the Wind, we had a teacher who was being prosecuted for teaching evolution, which was prohibited by Tennessee law. And the great lawyers Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan. Darrow was not a person of particular piety, was a free thinker, if you will, a very good lawyer. He defended the defendant in the trial. And William Jennings Bryan, who was a evangelical who had been Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson, a candidate for the presidency in 1896 and other times. He was for the prosecution as an expert witness. And the issue came to a head when Bryan was really challenged on his more fundamental view of Scripture and how Scripture is interpreted. But that trial was significant in showing the difference in the religious traditions between what was called fundamentalism and modernism. This arose because of the more historical and critical approaches to Scripture in seminaries and in the academy, if you will, and some trying to defend the tradition of viewing Scripture as being inerrant, of being the authority. Out of the Reformation, we heard that one of the expressions was sola scriptura, Scripture alone is the authority. And so when the historical critical approach to Scripture came about, it caused a great division amongst churches. Harry Emerson Fosdick was the senior minister or pastor at Riverside Church in New York. It was a church that was largely built with the funds of Rockefeller, who was a Baptist himself. And And so Fosdick got in the middle of this battle. He defended the historical critical method. He wrote a book that I have a copy of, Modern Uses of the Bible, and preached a sermon which said basically, shall the fundamentalists win? And so it threw down the gauntlet and split many churches. In fact, the churches that were most challenged by this were the Presbyterians, who had already split between North and South after the Civil War, but also the Disciples of Christ. Richard Wing and Glenn Miles, our past two senior ministers, were out of the Disciples tradition, but they split because the more orthodox or traditional view of Scripture became part of the Churches of Christ, which is different than the United Church of Christ, out of which I'm ordained. But you saw these splits over the question of how do I interpret the Scriptures and what is the authority of Scriptures. Those who are more fundamentalist took the view that the Scriptures are inerrant. When they say inerrancy, they meant not just as to matters of faith, but are inerrant as to matters of history, of sociology, psychology, science. And so the inerrant view came in conflict with the view that perhaps the Scriptures are inspired spiritually, but they're not textbooks, so to speak, on these other disciplines, including evolution, the way the world was created. This division was at the beginning of the 20th century, and is still with us, really, in all of the religious traditions, about how one interprets Scripture and what is the authority of Scripture for the different denominations and faith perspectives. And of course, there are many reasons why there are divisions in Christianity in this country and around the world, but most of them are over issues of polity and practice. Polity, how do we govern ourselves? Who has authority? We think of the expression of papal infallibility, which came about in the 19th century, giving the Pope the authority and investing the Pope with infallibility as to matters of faith and practice, or the more traditional view of Scripture, which when I say traditional, meaning the fundamental view, which the Scriptures are inerrant and the Bible alone is authority. So there are many divisions over who has authority and how one is governed. We ourselves started out as Grandview Heights Congregational Church, and the congregational churches believe in autonomy of the local church, that the local church decides how they govern themselves and how they practice their faith. And so in our situation, we don't look to, for example, a hierarchy for authority, even though we are bound in covenantal relationships in the United Church of Christ and the Disciples of Christ, to listen to other bodies such as the associations, the conferences, and the General Synod. But ultimately, we as the local congregation determine our matters of faith and practice. I myself went to a Methodist seminary, and it was very significant because I also went to Ohio Wesleyan, which was a Methodist college. Many of these institutions, certainly the colleges, were established as representatives of their particular denomination, in this case the Methodists. Many clergy were trained in these colleges, but they became freer from church allegiance and alliance as time went on. And certainly Methodism, we did not require chapel when I was there at Ohio Wesleyan. And while we took classes in the Bible if we chose, certainly it was not Methodist in inculcating Methodist practice or doctrine. And yet the roots of Methodism had a great influence on that institution as to how we live our lives as people of faith and how we act out our lives as people in service to others. But when I went to the Methodist seminary, certainly that was a place where ministers were being trained. And one of the things I learned was something called the Wesleyan quadrilateral, So when we look at a church and say, how do we interpret matters of faith and practice? In the Wesleyan tradition and the Methodist tradition, there are really four pillars, which is why it's called a quadrilateral. There's the tradition of the church, there's Holy Scripture, but not Scripture alone, but Holy Scripture. There is reason. We are people who are given minds and have the ability to reason and decide for matters of faith and practice using our minds. And then there's our experience as a community of faith, really over centuries now as people of faith, even though we've split into many denominations. So I think when we look at matters of faith and practice, whatever tradition we're out of, it is good to keep in mind, at least this quadrilateral, that these are aspects of how we act as human beings, and that tradition, Scripture, reason, and experience is not a bad way to look at matters of faith and practice, even though there are divisions amongst us as to whether some of these things are in sole authority, if you will. So this has resulted, as we come down into the 20th century, a time when we become much more pluralistic than we ever were, and we're much more secular than we were. As I said, when we came out of the revolution, one of the great principles was religious freedom. We disestablished the church. And yet in many ways, the role of church in society has continued to be one of struggle, if you will. Reading the American Gospel by John Meacham, we do know that this country, many people came here for freedom of religion, and that truly there is something called the American civil religion, that there's a general belief in God's providence, in God's will for our lives, but that we are free under this, including being free of religion, if you will, to not be required to be in a particular established church or community of faith. So our idea of religious freedom, and also really that freedom includes not being required to follow prescriptions of faith, is really part of our heritage. And yet when we look at the history of this country and the history of our churches, there have been many political issues that have, if you will, roiled the church, has resulted in conflict, splits, arguments. In the 19th century, the issue of alcohol, temperance, and prohibition were important issues, and the churches in society worked in this way against something that was viewed as a more personal sin. Issues of war and peace. I remember reading Ulysses S. Grant's memoirs. He thought the Mexican War was the most immoral war he knew in his lifetime, even though he was a military man. Issues of war and peace in my lifetime, particularly the Vietnam War, but even the more recent wars in the Middle East have been sources of conflict amongst people in the society, and the churches have been in the middle of that. When I was a student, there were times when the draft was challenged. People were burning their draft cards. The issue of conscientious objection, not being required to serve in the military, that was an important issue. Some people, I remember some Jesuits, the Berrigan brothers, raising the question about paying taxes for wars that they felt were immoral or could not be supported by people of faith. And of course, there was just outright opposition to many of these conflicts, which were undeclared wars or what used to be called police actions. So issues of war and peace have always been important within the churches. Civil rights. I mentioned earlier in these sessions how the churches split over the issue of slavery and the issue of eventually emancipation of anti-slavery, bringing about the emancipation through the war, really. It was only the war that permitted that to happen. But challenging fugitive slave laws and the institution of slavery came into the churches and divided churches. The issue of abortion, since Roe v. Wade, has continued to be an important issue to many people in churches, either on the side of choice or on the idea of prohibition of abortion, except in certain cases. Public funding for public school, or parochial schools, I should say. There are many private schools in this country. Not all of them are religiously affiliated. But the question of how much support the public should give private institutions of learning, since the public does support public schools. Within the church's ordination of women and LGBTQ rights have been issues not only in the society but within the churches. The issue of the role of the state in our churches. Some people have the flag in churches, others do not. And with a tradition of disestablishment of the church, should churches have flags in their churches or not? And that has been a bone of contention within communities of faith. Thinking of the Anglican tradition, which is a state church, certainly flags wave in those churches in England. But in our country, with no established religion and freedom of religion, that the question of the flag being in the worshiping space, also pledges of allegiance during war. Some groups have been pacifist and have not believed in making pledges to the state or to the country. And of course, very significant, particularly when I was growing up, prayer in public schools. There used to be uniform prayers that were said in public schools. As I mentioned before, one of the reasons for the establishment of Catholic schools was many of the people in the Catholic tradition felt that the public schools were Protestant schools because the use of the Bible and prayer in the public schools. So I just enumerate these many issues, knowing that all of you are well aware of all of them, or most of them, in our society and in our churches. But that is one of the things that has really challenged us in the role of faith and politics and religion. I preached on July 4th, and one of the issues in my community was having the parade on Sunday. Usually it was on a Monday or a Saturday. And I said that was an example really of how the church in some ways is disestablished. No longer can the society, which is more secular and certainly more pluralistic, describing all of these many traditions that I've described the last four sessions. It's certainly hard to say we should be doing anything as a matter of law, but we are free as people of faith to practice our faith as we choose. And so I think we have a great tradition both in history, in law, and in religion in this country. One of religious freedom, which includes even being free from compulsion in religion, which I think is a great thing because we have such a pluralistic society with our different religious traditions. And certainly American civil religion is still very much with us. We are people of faith, even as we are citizens. Although we are free, also many people came to this country to do well, not for religious freedom. But our tradition is great, and our tradition of pluralism and freedom, I think, has been part of what has made this country unique. And what has been unique is how we have grown in the number of different religious expressions, and that they are free to live their faith in our society. I've enjoyed being with you the last 4 weeks, and may God bless you always.